We're delighted today to be able to host John Githongo, Kenya's most prominent anti-corruption activist and CEO of Inuka, an NGO that works on citizen empowerment and good governance, as the speaker for the Coca-Cola World Fund lecture at Yale. The Coca-Cola lecture was established in 1992 by Roberto Guazzetta, former chair and CEO of Coca-Cola and Yale alumnus class of 1953, to support the intersecting endeavors among specialists in international relations, international law, and the management of international enterprises and organizations. Mr. Githongo is also chair of the Africa Institute for Governing with Integrity. He's a board member of the Africa Center for Open Governance and a commissioner for the Independent Commission on Aid Impact of the British government, for the British government. From 2003 to 2004, Mr. Githongo served as permanent secretary for governance and ethics in the post-transition government of Kenya's third president, Mwai Kibaki. However, he began to expose corruption within the administration that appointed him, a rare act of courage, and which necessitated his eventually having to leave the country. And he spent some time in Britain, but he returned to Kenya in 2008. His story is told in Michaela Wrong's book, It's Our Turn to Eat. In 2011, Mr. Githongo was selected as one of the 100 most influential Africans by New African magazine and one of the world's top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. He's also worked as a correspondent for The Economist magazine. The title he's chosen for today's lecture is Corruption, Security, and Development, Volatile Nexus. I'm pleased to introduce John Githongo.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I can take this with me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro, for that kind introduction. I should like to start by thanking Yale University and the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies for inviting me to deliver this Coca-Cola World Fund lecture and welcoming me to this wonderful city of New Haven and Yale University, which I have only read about and heard about. And the sun has actually been shining the last 2 days I've been here. I'll share some insights on corruption and security, on democracy and development, insecurity, corruption, and development, and the challenge that inequality poses to us now. And then identity-based politics in today's world and how resilient it has proved. And then I'll look up and forward. I'll always like to end with a positive note. Despite the fact that, well, we have to admit that 2014 was a terrible year for security and development, with the specter of conflict in the Middle East, Africa, and even the former Soviet Union rearing its ugly head. The past 2 days for me have been spent in the morning fielding telephone calls from colleagues in Europe and back in Kenya about what they're calling the Swiss leaks, scandal of these bank accounts at HSBC that have been made public by a crusading media organization. But for me, it tells an important story about corruption. I've had the privilege of being involved with Transparency International since its foundation. Peter Eigen, who was the founding chairman of Transparency International, was the head of the World Bank in Kenya. And I met him when I was still in high school. And he was a good friend of my father's. I was very skeptical about an NGO fighting corruption, even though I ended up becoming the first executive director of Transparency International in Kenya. But the whole Swiss leaks issue has reminded me about a reformalization of corruption since the early 2000s. After a period of what I would call informalization because of the activism that we saw in the 1990s when Transparency International was started, and the groups like the World Bank under Jim Wolfenson made corruption a key issue in the global development agenda. And so some of the progress that we've made has been drawn back. Secondly, and touching on corruption and security, we have a quiet joke when I was in government. I was in government for 2 years, just over 2 years, and that in Africa we shall fight to the last Nigerian, because it's Africa's most populous country, most powerful country, richest country, and the Nigerians are the most robust, confident people. And the Nigerian military, it's got its weaknesses, but has been essential to intervening in some of the worst crises that we've had in West Africa over the past 2 decades. And yet, over the last 1.5 years, it has been alarming for all of us who watch these issues to see the Nigerian army at some points fleeing in the face of a group like Boko Haram. And that has been challenging to us. Just recently, I mean, the last 48, 72 hours, the military has announced that they cannot guarantee security for the elections, so the elections have been postponed until the end of March. Which brings us to Kenya as well, where we are faced with a unique challenge. The Kenya Army went into Somalia in late 2011 against the Horn of Africa's Al-Qaeda affiliate, which is called Al-Shabaab. And the blowback subsequently has exposed some of our pressing governance challenges. And at the heart of those, when we have 4,000 troops in Somalia, is how corruption undermines the ability of our security sector to prosecute its core mandate, something which, especially the middle class, had always taken for granted, that if you're middle class, you'll be protected by the police and by the army. But here they're confronted by a group that is able to undermine that. We've also learned an important lesson about these groups, a group like Al-Shabaab, and their extraordinary capacity to reinvent themselves, to evolve and transform themselves, and that they're organizationally designed to change according to the changing contexts, which makes them deeply resilient. The other insight that we have learned when these groups are confronted, especially by a corrupt opponent, is that they're not actually trying to win. Al-Shabaab is not trying to win anything in Kenya, in the conventional sense. They aim to survive, to subvert, and to undermine the essential edifice to which they are inherently opposed. This realization has changed the language used in their regard. Soldiers no longer talk of victory or success against what is essentially an idea that seems to have gone wild. They talk of the degradation of the capacity to wage terror. They're degrading the capacity. I'll talk about what does victory mean against these groups, especially when they're confronted by states whose capacity is undermined by corruption. Let me focus a little more on that, on corruption and the lessons from Al-Qaeda / Al-Shabaab in Kenya, which are very poignant to us in Kenya. As I said, one of the lessons has been that corruption rots all institutions when it's in a society, when it becomes systemic and pervasive. And when it grips the security services, then we see the kind of things that we're seeing in Nigeria, and that we caught a glimpse of in Kenya, much to our alarm. Before the Kenya Army invaded Somalia to deal with Al-Shabaab, quote unquote. Al-Shabaab earned about $800,000 a year from the port of Kismayo. Revenues earned mainly from taxing goods that were being smuggled into Kenya, like sugar and other things. Between 20 and 40,000 metric tons of sugar was coming in through Kismayo into Kenya. By late 2012, 4 million sacks of charcoal worth $60 million was sitting quayside in Kismayo. And the Kenya Army had successfully, together with the support of AMISOM troops from other African countries, taken control of that port from Al-Shabaab. From November that same year, unfortunately, and this is again the price of corruption, our own Kenya Defense Forces and our allies started allowing exports out of the port. In 2013, 1 million sacks of charcoal left the port every month. The trade was handled by 40 Al-Shabaab affiliated traders. Between July 2013 and May 2014, it's estimated that 6.8 million bags of charcoal were exported out of Kismayo, to the extent that by last year, the UN concluded that Al-Shabaab continues to benefit from revenue generated on a scale greater than when it controlled Kismayo. The revenues were split three ways between Al-Shabaab, an outfit that some of you may have heard of called Ras Kamboni, which has always been fairly strong in that part of Somalia. And these are the forces who ran actually the port, and the Kenyan business interests facilitated by our own military. So the invasion has made Al-Shabaab richer, and they've brought the fight to us in Kenya. Over 100 attacks since November 2011. We've had over 100 attacks within Kenya. Something that is completely, I wouldn't say we're not accustomed to it, because we had the 1998 Al-Qaeda attack at the US Embassy in Nairobi and also the US Embassy in Dar es Salaam. So, Al-Qaeda has been around us for some time, but we've always felt on top of it. Over the past 2 years, these attacks have shaken our own confidence in our security services, because there have been so many, culminating in one in September 2013 that saw one of the most prestigious malls in Nairobi, the Westgate Mall, attacked by a small group of terrorists, and 67 people killed and over 100 injured in what was a fiasco for our security services. Our response has also not helped. Since 2012, 21 Muslim clerics have been assassinated, and an operation to flush out terrorists from Nairobi in April 2014 was carried out in a manner that further alienated the Muslim community and the Somali community in particular, because the raids were accompanied by reports of bribes, corruption, rape, as were carried out. So corruption has helped to fuel radicalism and radicalization of our youth as we have responded to the problem. So with every response, we seem sometimes to make the problem worse. Corruption, we've always said, is carried out by embedded networks, particularly in countries where it is systemic and pervasive. These networks include, of necessity, four groups of players. You have the politicians who give the cover. You have the bureaucrats who push the paper from one office to the next. You have the private sector, which includes usually briefcase businessmen who just have an account in the Cayman Islands and a briefcase and are moving together with the politicians and bureaucrats. And the security sector. You always need somebody in the military or intelligence services for a grand corruption scheme to happen in many third world countries. One of the important realizations that we've made over the past decade and a half is the critical role to the architecture of corruption of the service sector, the global banks, and international legal firms. And here I'm talking about legal firms that are able to operate in multiple jurisdictions at the same time. So a transaction may be initiated in Kenya, but the payments are made in Mauritius, and the money goes to Switzerland, then to British Virgin Islands, and then back to Nairobi through client accounts. And the role of the banks, the legal sector, the telecom companies, real estate mortgage firms are essential to the grand corruption that we're seeing today. The financial crisis that we saw here in the West in 2008 revealed a deeper malaise. And I think this is not something that is negative in the long run. That in the fight against corruption, there are those who are sometimes too big to fail or too big to jail. And it exposes the outer limits of what's possible using the tools of the rule of law to tackle corruption in contexts where entire financial and political systems are in the grip of a particular way of doing things. I often challenge my colleagues when we're talking about corruption in Africa, that I'm still waiting to see, because the message that is brought to us when I was in government, I was always being pushed by diplomats and World Bank, IMF. You must fry the big fish. Until you fry the big fish, you're not fighting corruption. Until we see a politician in court, a senior civil servant in court, you're not fighting corruption. And I can now say, well, it seems to be difficult to fry the big fish here as well. And so it's a global issue that we need to address together. Now I'll speak to that near the end. One of the responses to this, and driven also by digital technology plus a younger generation that is a lot more skeptical about politics, politicians, political parties, is an unregimented kind of social sanction that has kicked in. So you have WikiLeaks, you have Mr. Edward Snowden, and a host of other manifestations of people blowing the whistle and putting information into the public domain in a way that would not have been possible or would not have happened 20 or 25 years ago. So this is the reality that we're living in, and this is, for me, I see there's the younger generation, which is the majority, that has this sense of exhaustion that pushes this very, very strongly. My second overall point is to do with democracy and development. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, democracy swept across the former Soviet Union, across the African continent, but now, today, is challenged by other models. We have seen rapid economic growth without this kind of multi-party democracies that we've adopted in parts of Africa, in China, for example. And so this model has some appeal, especially to those of our leaders who are more authoritarian leaning. This is a fairly attractive model, and it has made a difference. However, we acknowledge that with the Chinese model, we're talking about a highly organized state. And when one does the research, the Chinese had a state as long as 1,800 years ago. So it has very deep cultural roots. But still, we are coming to terms with the fact that while we've adopted multi-party politics with all its institutions and rules and regulations, liberal democracy is not going to result in large parts of the third world. It's not going to happen. Kenya is not going to become Norway or Sweden. So what's it going to become? And we're in the process of defining that now. The process is extremely messy because we've gone into state building in some cases before nation building, where you don't have a sense of collective nationhood in places where a state with its institutions are already being crafted. I said the process is messy, and so sometimes some of the violence that we see around the world, in my opinion, can be seen as states collapsing or nation building taking place as borders are torn down. Secondly, the liberal democracies that we have adopted, the economic model that comes with them has delivered growth, sometimes without development, and often growth without equity. And it's a challenge here in the West as well, where inequality has become the challenge of the age. And inequality means a concentration of power. And a concentration of power, no matter how graceful or delicate, no matter how gracefully or delicately executed, means corruption. It necessarily discriminates against the young, the women, the less educated, minorities, and the poor generally. Thirdly, I'll go back to this nexus between security, corruption, and development, and this unraveling that we are seeing, where we seem to be going back to a Cold War posture. And I would argue that this is partly as a result of the resilience of identity politics in large parts of the world, which we had thought would be undermined by countries adopting multi-party democracy and liberal democracy and politics generally. The Cold War was clear and stark in its definitions, and the Berlin Wall fell, and we saw a flourishing of democracy. Freedom House and other such organizations argue that we've been in the middle of a democratic recession since 2006. One thing that seems to have happened, and this is drawn very much from my own African experience of democratization since the early 1990s, is that more and more regimes in this pluralistic era have lost their monopoly of violence. And we've seen a gradual erosion or deterioration of legitimate authority of all governments, leaders, and political parties. And this is not only limited to Africa, but across the world. And so I've read research that actually governments, I think Professor Moz Naim describes it, governments are more Italian. They last shorter, more coalitions. Overwhelming victories are rare. You don't have landslide victories anymore. You have close victories, highly contested elections, and those administrations last a short time, and the politicians are mistrusted, especially by the youth, as they don't trust or believe in them. I should like to argue, at least from where we stand, is that identity-based formations have taken away the state's monopoly of violence. And in a sense, this is partly what groups like Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, etc. And then what we are watching happening in parts of Africa, like the Central African Republic, Niger, Mali, South Sudan, is happening is a regressive identity-based authoritarianism. And it's responded to asymmetrically because it rigs elections, it controls the media, it discombobulates civil society, and it's represented in the international war against terror by the IED versus the drone, anonymous WikiLeaks, SwissLeaks, that I've already mentioned before, and a convergence between commercial and political interests at a time the private sector is consolidating its hold on public policy. So this legitimate authority of the institutions of governance has been ground down and eroded over time. One can ask a question, how come even authoritarian regimes are unable to keep a lid on identity-based security challenges? And it's often because they themselves mobilize along identity lines, especially in this quote-unquote, post-ideological phase, even if they pretend otherwise. And so, I've been very struck by what's been happening in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, in particular, and Ukraine recently, where there is this sort of nationalistic upsurge that is developing there. And I don't think it is something that is limited to that part of the world at all. So we live in a volatile time where the nations and states that we are going to forge will need to take the resilience of some of these factors into account. So I'd like to look forward and look up going forward. And one fundamental reality in that this I'll take very much from the Kenyan context is the research that is done by a group like Afrobarometer every few years that does opinion polls across the African continent in terms of what Africans believe and feel about their democracy. And one of the important things, despite the democratic rollback that we are seeing in many countries, people remain committed to democracy as a model. I think it was Churchill who said it's the worst form of government except all others. People remain very committed to democracy and to the freedoms that they have won, freedom of association, of speech, partly because they can remember what it was like not to have those freedoms. And when you can remember and your parents can remember, it gives you a tremendous incentive to hold it. Secondly, the other models aren't that attractive, no matter how powerful and how much attention, how much bandwidth they're taking up. I've not even heard my Muslim friends talking about wanting to live in the caliphate of Mr. al-Baghdadi. The other models are not that compelling. And so it makes sense that regardless of how messy democracy is, it remains the system of governing ourselves that people remain very, very committed to. Secondly, it may do, and this is something that at the UN, at the United Nations level, 2 points. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption was ratified in 2003. It's been about 12, 13 years now. I think it's time for a review of its implementation around the world, given what we are seeing and the fact that corruption is back, stronger than ever, and around the world. Now, when you have the kind of scandals, not only in the third world, but in the first, it's good because now we can look each other in the face and say that, we have difficulties in Africa, but here in America too, you have challenges. Let's discuss them as equals and honestly. So let's review how serious the provisions of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption are after all this time, if corruption has worsened, as Transparency International and others show in their indexes. Secondly, the Millennium Development Goals, and this is something that I've been plugging. They didn't expire, but their 15-year run came to an end in December, and a committee has been formed at the UN to come up with new global development goals. I think that started its work last month. There were big meetings at the UN in September and December, and so we've been advocating to get more accountability and anti-corruption provisions in the next round of development goals, and it's an opportunity to lobby for that. Thirdly, and this was initially a G7 initiative last year, pushed very much by Britain and the United States, of creating a register of beneficial ownership of corporations, especially in the tax havens, transparency in those tax havens. We need that more than ever before, because the ability to hide money hinges very heavily on the secrecy around these tax havens. And the truth of the matter is this. I talked about the embedded corruption networks. They've globalized too. And one of the things that we have found in our part of the world, when we look at the drug trade, when we look at environmental corruption, which is hitting us very hard, which is the trade in ivory, rhino horns, and plants and the like. When one looks at people trafficking, slavery, it is now more profitable for organized crime to be involved in the trafficking of slavery of girls than trading in heroin. Money laundering, the laundering of corruption proceeds, all the networks that are used, especially in the service sector, are the same for all of them. It's usually the same banks. In the 1990s, the movement of terrorism finances in our part of the world used forex bureaus, hawala systems, etc. Partly because of external pressure and also internal pressure, this has gone down, and to our surprise, said it's been reformalized. It's gone back into the formal system. So you'll drive, and I've been to a number of cities in many parts of the world where you'll see car showrooms with very high-end vehicles, SUVs, several $1 million of them that aren't selling. You pass there week after week, it's the same vehicles are there. And that's in that jurisdiction, that's a legitimate company with a legitimate bank account, with the lawyers managing their affairs. And so we've had a reformalization of the illicit resources that are managed by these networks globally. So I ask the question, and I often get in trouble for this, have we reached, do we need a corruption transitional justice cutoff point? And I'll explain what I mean by that. After the end of apartheid in South Africa, it was recognized that there had to be some closure with this horrible history that South Africa had to be able to move forward with some confidence. Now, the compromises and that have to be made in that kind of process are always contentious. And actually, if they're not contentious, then it's not working. You can't have one side that emerges out of that kind of process very happy. Everybody has to emerge a bit happy and a bit unhappy. These tools that are used in the human rights arena, could some of them be used vis-a-vis corruption to introduce transparency, especially in this era of too big to fail, too big to jail, too big to fry, where we can introduce an international regime of transparency accompanied with aggressive disclosure at the global UN level with oversight regarding financial flows, complete with an international anti-corruption judicial instrument to deal with these massive flows that we've now recognized, overlap from terrorism to drugs to people trafficking. Is it time to start discussing the creation of such instruments at the UN level, to add on or to spruce up the United Nations Convention Against Corruption? Fifthly, is the issue of campaign finance and lobbying. Has a time come for us to accept that the relationships that come with lobbying and campaign finance are so fraught with potentialities for corruption and are potentially so disadvantageous to minorities and the poor that let's take finance parties as much as possible. And I'll leave that there. But political party finance has been something that I've been grappling with for the last 20 years, and no one has really given me a model that works very well. The only places I've seen interesting attempts is where you have state finance of political parties, and you don't have a disproportionate power by private interests. Last but not least, in the war against terror, I think one of the big lessons that, and I want to talk very much from the Kenyan perspective, is that we realize that it will be won by Muslims and by our Muslims in our own context, in our own society. And there is no other way of going about it. Said with Al-Shabaab, the lesson that surprised us that when you talk to their sympathizers, you ask them, okay, when you win, what does that victory look like? It doesn't. There's no answer to that, and they are pleased that they're confronted by a corrupt opponent on the other side. That being the case, we've realized that for it to be dealt with in a manner that is conclusive, it is our own Muslim community that is part of our society that has the answers to these questions, but they need to be put in a manner. I heard it put it, when you see all the problems as a nail, then you use a hammer to hit them all, and perhaps it's time to put down the hammer sometimes when dealing with these issues. Finally, and this is drawn very much from the experience of Eastern Africa as we deal with these developmental and security contradictions. We've come to an aspirational conclusion with colleagues when we discuss this, that we have borders across a continent in 54 countries that were drawn up by the colonial powers. And actually we will not have peace and security until some of those borders come down, disappear. That regional integration, economic, political, and social, is an imperative for the survival of certain countries. Some countries are simply not viable economically or politically, and that breakdown needs to happen sooner rather than later. And the process has already started, the recognition has been made, but vested interests continue to hold out. But the urgency has been raised by the fact that we are confronted now with what I would describe as a world-class enemy. If Al-Qaeda has given the US so much trouble, you can expect that it's giving us a lot of trouble in Kenya and the Horn of Africa as well. Finally, and this is an issue which I always raise very tentatively, because in my anti-corruption circles, I've always objected to the idea that corruption has a cultural aspect to it. Because I was very, very suspicious when people talk of corruption and culture, they say some cultures are more corrupt than others. And I feel that there's a racial thing going on there. I say, no, it's the same everywhere. But I spent some time in South Sudan advising the government about 2-3 years ago, and sitting with the elders from the Nuer and Dinka communities. They told me, in our languages we don't have a word for corruption. We have only got a word for theft. We know a thief, And in fact, a thief, the thief cannot get married across the valley. That we understand. And I'll close there. I mean, that's, for me, has been a humbling lesson taught to me by elders in the countryside in South Sudan. We've been talking about the fight against corruption, good governance, transparency, accountability, all these nice words we learned after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And when I went into the countryside outside Juba, it's the old man who told me, this corruption thing, really, what is it? But if somebody steals my cows, that's a thief. And he cannot be allowed to go into government. He cannot marry my daughter. I'll leave it there and open it up to questions. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.